You know something that I find really weird? There's a lot of people out there that don't like playing multiplayer games. Of course, there's a lot of people out there that do like playing multiplayer games. All the most popular games in the world are multiplayer games. But still, there are a number of people out there that I've seen that just pretty much stick almost entirely to single-player games. And that's something that's just always been very strange to me. I don't really understand why you would limit yourself from the types of games that you play in that kind of way. Because multiplayer games can be so varied. It's not like a genre. You can play multiplayer games of almost any kind, and yet I know a good number of people that just don't like to play multiplayer games. And so I started thinking, why is that? One of the reasons I've heard is that some people don't like the social element of playing multiplayer games. They enjoy games as a solo activity. They don't want to play with other people. They enjoy playing games by themselves. And you know what? That's totally understandable. And honestly, I can't even really give a good argument against that. The only thing I can really say is that with online gaming, it's very possible to have almost or no interaction at all with other people when you're playing games. So in practice, it ends up just being like you're playing a single-player game, but with the benefits of playing against people. But another reason, I think, comes from the mentality that I think a lot of people seem to have when it comes to how they treat games as a hobby, I guess. Because I see a number of people that seem to think of games like people think of movies or TV shows or reading books, where a game comes out and you get it and you play it and then you beat the game and then you're finished with it, as you would watching a show, where a show comes out, you watch the whole season and then you finish the season and then you're done until the next season comes out or another show comes out that you want to watch, and you just go from one thing to the other, starting it, finishing it, moving on. And it's treating games almost as like a disposable form of entertainment in that way. And I definitely understand where that comes from, because that's kind of the nature of a lot of single-player games. They have a beginning and they have an ending, and you play through the game and then you've beaten the game. And other than like extra side stuff or doing a replay, there's not a whole lot to do at that point, so you're done with it, and maybe you'll come back one day, but for the most part, you just move on to something else. But I think people like that idea of a game having a definitive beginning and an ending, and so when you show them a multiplayer game where you just play matches and you keep playing matches for as long as you want, that's something that's not as appealing to those people, because that doesn't fit nicely into their idea of playing a game, finishing it, moving on to the next thing. How do you finish a game that never ends? But I think it's very possible to enjoy multiplayer games in that kind of way, where you get it and you play it for a bunch, and then eventually you get your fill of it. You've played enough matches and you're satisfied with the experience you got playing that game, and then you kind of put it on the shelf and you move on to other stuff, and maybe sometime down the line you get the itch to go back to it, and so you pull it out again and play a bunch more matches until you get your fill again. In that way, I would argue that you could play multiplayer games in a very similar fashion to single-player games, with a definitive beginning and end. The only difference is that with a multiplayer game, you determine for yourself when the ending is. But also, you don't have to play multiplayer games as like the game that you're focused on and playing right now. You could have multiplayer games there on the side, where you just bust it out every now and then when you feel like it. You play a couple matches and then you put it down, and you can go back to it whenever you want. Of course, you could do the exact same thing with a single-player game, but maybe it's just me. Personally, I feel that doesn't really work as well with single-player games. I think they're better played where you do the whole game in a relatively short period of time, where that's like the game you're playing through and focusing on. I think that works better for single-player games because, you know, if there's a story, then if you go too long without playing, you're going to forget some of the story. You're going to forget where you are in the game, what you were supposed to be doing, all that kind of stuff. But with multiplayer games, because a single match is just a couple of minutes of investment, I think they're a lot easier to just jump back into repeatedly over a period of time. But I guess people might be able to see that as it's kind of cutting into their, time with the main game they're focusing on, so I could understand that not being the most appealing thing in the world. But still, I think it's very possible to fit multiplayer games into that kind of disposable entertainment format that a lot of people seem to like to do with games. But I think by far the biggest reason that a lot of people don't like to play multiplayer games is getting good, the need to get good, or rather, the perceived need to get good. Because I have heard countless stories of people that try to play online multiplayer games and they just get wrecked every time. It's just impossible. Everybody is way too good. These goddamn try-hard sweat lords that are fucking got no lives and all they do is spend their time playing this game and they ruin it for everybody. Games are just supposed to be fun. I'm just trying to have fun here and these guys are ruining it by trying so hard to win and bleh. They're awful. And these people end up with this mentality that the only way you can enjoy the game is if you, totally devote yourself to it and spend countless hours playing it, practicing, getting as good as you can. It's the only way to play. So if I'm going to start a multiplayer game, then oh my god, it's such a time investment. I don't have time for that. And to be honest, it's a little bit hard for me to argue with the people that feel this way because I don't typically personally feel that way with games. I usually don't feel like I need to put in a lot of time to get really good at a game in order to be able to enjoy it, because I generally pick up games pretty quickly, and I don't have that much trouble when I start playing a game online. For me, it's very easy to start having fun with a game pretty quickly. And yeah, I am generally above average in terms of skill from most players, so it's hard for me to say exactly, but maybe there is a little bit of truth to the need to put in some effort to get good at a multiplayer game to enjoy it. But I don't think it's as black and white as people make it out to be. I don't think it's the only way to have fun is to become super duper good. I think it's more of a gradient kind of thing. At least personally, I find that multiplayer games, competitive games, get more fun the better you are at them. The more you understand the game, the more that you can do, the better opponents that you can face without getting totally blown out. That makes the gameplay more intense. That makes the decisions you have to make as a player much more difficult, much more taxing, much more fun. Pushing your skill to the very limit and trying to grow it and push it beyond, for me, is one of the draws of multiplayer games and is one of the things that makes them fun. But that's not something that's exclusive to multiplayer games in my case. I enjoy that with lots of games. That's why I make YouTube videos about them. And of course, the whole point of this channel is to encourage people to try to get better at games, because I think there's a lot of fun in getting good at games. So that's the main thing I would say to that point, is you don't need to spend endless hours getting good at a game. You just need to put in a little bit more time to get a little bit better, and you'll start having a bit more fun. And the more time you put in to get better at a game, the more fun you'll have. And when I say put in time to get better, I don't mean go out of your way to practice and look up strats and all this kind of stuff. I just mean play. Just play it a bunch and deal with getting your ass handed to you a couple of times, and just over time, naturally, you're going to get better and the game will become more fun. And that idea can create a bit of a negative cycle that I think contributes to people not getting very into multiplayer games, because the more you play a game, the more fun it gets. But if you start playing a game and you're very bad at it and you keep losing and you're not having fun, then you're going to stop playing it. And because you're not playing it, you're not getting better. And because you're not getting better, the game's not getting more fun. And I think that cycle is what keeps a lot of people from getting into multiplayer games, because every time they try, it's the same story over and over, because they don't give themselves the time to get into a multiplayer game and see what's there. But with that cycle, the inverse is also true. The more you play a game, the better you get at it, the more fun it becomes. The more fun it is, the more you're going to play the game, and the more you play it, the better you'll get, and then that will keep on looping as well. That is, if you actually enjoy the game. There's plenty of games that you're just not going to like. But there is one more reason I think people don't play very many multiplayer games, and I think it comes down to ego, actually. When people play single-player games by themselves, it's a solitary activity that they can enjoy without any kinds of social pressures whatsoever. But once you start playing with other people, once you know that there are other people that are seeing you play, seeing your performance, seeing how good you are, there's often a degree of pressure that gets put on you to perform well, just naturally as humans. We don't want to come off as negative in some kind of way. You don't want to embarrass yourself. You don't want to come off as bad at the game. especially people that play a lot of video games, usually some kind of self-confidence forms that, I'm a gamer, I play lots of games, I'm pretty good at games, but then suddenly you go online, you play a multiplayer game, and you realize you're not as good as you thought you were, and for a lot of people, that can really kill the fun. That blow to your ego, that reality check, it can get pretty brutal, man. And I say that from experience. I'm someone that definitely has a lot of pride in my ability and my skill when it comes to playing games. And back in the day, I used to get very upset and very frustrated when I would play multiplayer games and I would start going on losing streaks and I'd play very poorly, make lots of mistakes and get bothered by it and angry. And I would become, hesitant to load up a game that I like because the last session I had, I didn't do very well, and that creates even further pressure because, I don't want that to happen again, so I really gotta play good this time. You can really psych yourself out when all you're trying to do is have fun playing a game. And really, the only thing I can say to that is you have to learn to accept the reality of the situation. You have to come to understand and be comfortable with the fact that there are gonna be people that are a lot better than you at games, and people that are worse than you, and learning where you stand is a fine thing. Knowing that you're not as good as other people or as good as you thought you were, that's fine. You gotta get over this idea of winning and losing. Winning and losing in a game really does not matter whatsoever. The game is competitive, yes, and winning is your objective, but I don't play a game to win. My goal when I play a game is just to have fun. Trying to win is just a part of playing the game. Whether I do or not does not change how much fun I have with it. As long as I can play and have good matches where I play well and do cool stuff and have fun, I'm having a good time. And it's a hard thing to tell people to just adopt this kind of mentality. It's something that you really gotta internalize on your own and realize for yourself that that kind of thing just does not matter. So those to me are a lot of the reasons why I think a lot of people don't really get into multiplayer games. And in various ways, all of those are totally legitimate reasons for why you would not want to play those kinds of games. Especially when you consider the fact that single-player games don't have any of these problems. You don't need to worry about the social element, or the need to get good, or the anxiety of performing in front of other people. None of that stuff exists. You can just play a game and relax by yourself. So why on earth would I put up with all this in order to play a multiplayer game? Yeah, they're fun, but so are single-player games. What's the big deal? Well, I don't really have much of a response to that, but what I will say is that multiplayer games can offer a different kind of fun than what you find in single-player games. There's a lot of really cool stuff that only can exist in multiplayer games because of their competitive nature, because you're playing against other human beings. And I think those things are what make playing multiplayer games worthwhile. What kind of things? Well, firstly, at a basic level, a lot of game design options become available that really aren't that viable or very good in a single-player context. An easy example of that would be level design. In a single-player game, typically levels either have a beginning and end, point A to B kind of structure, or they're more like an open area with a bunch of objectives placed around for things that you can do. But in multiplayer games, you can create levels that don't have any kind of design direction for them and don't have any kind of motivation for the players to do anything in particular on the level. They can just be empty arenas with terrain and environment strewn about, and that works because those levels don't exist to give the player this single experience of playing through this level. They exist to be settings for matches to take place on, and all they need to do is offer a variety of engagement types with the terrain and how that influences the gameplay of these matches. And because every match is going to be different, the same area in a level that has no hard design purpose can serve many different functions depending on what's happening in a single match. But that's kind of just like the basic stuff. The more interesting thing that you get out of playing multiplayer games against other people is that people provide the greatest challenge that any game could ever provide to you. Enemies and AI and all that kind of stuff, it can only go so far. There's a lot of stuff that enemy AI just cannot do in a game. AIs have to be preset to behave in a certain way, and they'll do certain things in certain situations every single time, and they can't go beyond the bounds of what they were set to do. whereas people can be creative. They have limitless possibilities of what they can do. They can look at a level or a tool set available in the game, and they could come up with their own way of playing that. That offers you a different opposition every single time you play the game, because every opponent is going to be a little bit different and play slightly differently. On top of that, people are not limited to a single playstyle. People can adapt and they can change. They can, on the fly, make different choices and suddenly start playing in a different way. They can react to what's happening, and suddenly you are playing against something that is far more intelligent and is reactive to you in a way that an AI just never could. And those interactions allow for an unprecedented amount of variety in the gameplay situations that can occur, because as players are interacting with each other, reacting to each other, adjusting how they play, it creates just an infinite number of possible scenarios that you can end up in. Another thing is that in single-player games, generally, the game is always designed to be beaten. Every challenge can be overcome in a game with 100% certainty, and it might be something really fucking hard and something you're not good enough to beat, but someone can beat it, and it's meant to be beaten. But with multiplayer games, that's not necessarily the case. Because your opponent is a human that can have an adaptive level of skill, you don't know if something is going to work. You can do the right thing in the right situation, and it just doesn't work because your opponent was too good, and they were able to stop it from working. Because of that, it creates uncertainty in the gameplay that doesn't come from randomness. You can never be 100% sure that what you do in a competitive game is going to work, because you're always relying on the ability of your opponents not being able to handle what you throw at them, and so you have to gamble. You have to try things that you don't know if they're going to work. You have to experiment and see what happens. Sometimes you might come out on top, sometimes you won't. But in the situations when it does work, it'll be so much more satisfying than it is in a single-player game, because it relied on your opponent not being as good as you, not being good enough to handle what you threw at them, which means you're good enough to overwhelm another player. And that's a very satisfying feeling. That's very cool. That's not something you get from AI in games, because AI have no limits. They don't have anything that they cannot do. AI, if they wanted, if they were programmed in such a way, could shut down every single thing that you throw at them. They don't, because it's a single-player game and it's meant to be beaten. So enemies will allow themselves to get hit. They will allow themselves to fail. They will allow themselves to get defeated by the player. It's how they're programmed. People won't do that. People will do absolutely everything they can to stop you and make sure that they come out on top. And so when you throw people at each other, both trying to do that same thing, it creates this locked horn gameplay where someone is going to come out on top. Someone is going to do something that the other person just cannot deal with, and that is really cool, to overwhelm another player's ability like that. And the better your opponent is, it becomes even cooler when you're able to overwhelm them. On the flip side, being the player that's overwhelmed, it tells you that you have more room to grow, to get better as a player. When something does come at you and you can't handle it, you can learn from that experience and get better, and now, the next time it happens, you will be able to handle it, and when that occurs, you're going to feel really good about yourself. Because now there's less things that people can overwhelm you with. There's less things they can throw at you that you can't handle. And just like how it can be really cool to overwhelm another player, it can also be really cool to know that another player was unable to overwhelm you. You were too good for them to break through your defenses. And again, the better that player was that was unable to beat you, the cooler it is. And that's what I'm talking about when I say getting better at multiplayer games is what makes them more fun. Then we get to the higher level stuff, the metagame elements, the stuff that doesn't exist inside the game or the design or its mechanics, the stuff where you're trying to play not the game, but the people you're playing against. You know, there's certain unwritten rules that exist in certain games about how to play them, and once you learn those rules, you can kind of get a feel for how players are going to play, and you can start to abuse that fact. A simple example that anyone that's decent at a shooter will be familiar with is that if you're running around a corner and you take a bullet in the back, it's pretty likely that that guy's going to try to chase you around that corner and finish you off. And so you can lead them into an ambush knowing that they're probably going to come around that corner. You know where they're going to be, but as they round the corner, they don't necessarily know exactly where you are, and it can give you an edge. Learning the tendencies of players at large and just how they play a game can be a very satisfying thing because it lets you start to play around the players and go beyond the limits of playing the game well. Now you're playing the people well. And then beyond that, that's when we get into adaptation. When you encounter a player that doesn't do the same things that most players do, and they're a little bit better than that, they're a little smarter than that, suddenly the tactics that you devise that work against lots of players, they don't work against this guy. So you're going to have to adapt. You're going to have to change up how you play if you want to beat him. And how are you going to do that? You're going to have to come up with something new and hope that it works. And what if it doesn't? You're going to have to come up with something else until it does eventually work. And if it doesn't, again, it means you still got room to grow and get better. But if it does, then that too can be very satisfying. That there was that one guy who you just could not deal with every time you ran into him, but then you did. You finally got the upper hand on him in that one time. You bested him. You figured out what he was doing, and you figured out how to counter it. But then you gotta remember, you're playing against a person here, which means he can adapt as well. Suddenly now he has a counterattack for your counterattack. What's your plan now? You're gonna have to adapt again. Can you adapt further? Do you have any more ideas of how you can deal with this guy's new tactic that he's pulling out? And this constant adaptation to your opponents and how they play, this just goes on forever and ever and ever, and then it evolves into mind games where once you play against somebody enough, you can start to notice patterns in how they play and what they do, and you can start to predict what they're going to do in various situations. Once you get to that level, oh boy is it fun. If you're able to read another player in a game, if you know what they're going to do before they do it, and you can shut it down, oh my god, there is no feeling in a competitive game better than that. And if we really wanted to get into it, we could talk about the infinite depth of mind games and how far they go forever, but I'm not going to do that. Not right now, at least. But what I want to emphasize is that all of these things that I just talked about, all of this interesting stuff that comes from playing multiplayer games, it only exists because they are multiplayer games, because you're playing against people, because you're playing against something as intelligent as you are that can change how it plays around how you play. It's an experience that you can only get playing multiplayer games, and it's incredibly fun when you can finally get into it. And I think for a lot of people that don't play multiplayer games, this whole world of competitive gaming that I just explained, beyond the mechanics, beyond all that, about playing the people, I think a lot of people have no idea that this exists, because they've never experienced it firsthand. They play a game, they are really bad at it, they don't get into it, and then they stop. And to those people, I think this kind of stuff is totally invisible, and they have no idea it's there. And so I don't want to get on my soapbox and be like, you should play multiplayer games, because I say so, because blah blah blah. That was not my intention with this video. What I wanted to do was explain all these things that I think a lot of people miss out on of multiplayer games, all the richness that's there, that's just waiting to be dove into, that a lot of people that avoid them have no idea about. And hopefully I made them sound appealing and fun and cool in a way that you weren't aware of before, and maybe I've made you want to check out some multiplayer games a little bit. At least that's my hope. If not, well, that's fine. At the very least, thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed. I'll see you next video.